And joining us today, we have Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So like we heard in the previous report, it's widely expected that President Moon Jae-in will be using his trip to Singapore and Papua New Guinea to upgrade relations with Southeast Asian nations, as well as drumming up international support for his peace initiative with North Korea. Now, of particular interest is a string of bilateral meetings that he's scheduled to have, given that it comes at a time when dialogue between North Korea and the U.S. have seemingly stalled. In this sense, would you say the trip has extra significance?
Most definitely. I think he has some agenda that's relevant to these meetings that he wants to promote. But at the same time, given where the situation is on the peninsula between North Korea and the United States, I think he also wants to get some more out of this meeting, especially given that he's got some really high-level meetings planned with Vice President Mike Pence and President Xi Jinping, as well as President Vladimir Putin. All three players, obviously major players in the region. China and Russia hasn't been in the news as much lately, but they're clearly important given their role both on the Security Council and their interests in the region. So it's important, I think, to bring them into the dialogue and get a buy-in from both Beijing and Moscow on these issues. So yes, it's very important for President Moon.
So you mentioned his talks with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. Now, Pence is pursuing a hardline stance on North Korea. Recently, in an op-ed, he said that Washington will continue to exert pressure on North Korea until complete denuclearization. Now, do you think President Moon will be able to get the talks between North Korea and the U.S. back on track through these bilateral talks?
Well, we've seen this kind of situation before when the talks were called off initially in August with Secretary Pompeo's scheduled visit being canceled by President Trump over by tweet, and then there was a lull and it wasn't clear at that time exactly what was going to happen between Washington and Pyongyang. President Moon stepped in again, series of meetings with Kim Jong-un, culminating in a summit in Pyongyang that brought the talks back online again. So expect to see similar kind of move by President Moon. If this meeting is not going to be enough for President Moon and Vice President Pence, then expect another visit to Washington or some other way of engaging with President Trump about these issues. And secondly, it's important to understand that Vice President Pence is part of the Trump administration. So he really reflects that maximum pressure aspect of this, that there's pressure that is still there as the U.S. is claiming, and while they're engaging constructively with the North Koreans to see if there are ways to move forward on the denuclearization front. So this is not necessarily a contradictory move on the part of the United States. The policy itself looks contradictory, but essentially the pressure is still in place while the Trump administration is trying to find a diplomatic solution to this problem.
Yep, so it's a meeting to keep our eyes on. You also said talks between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. So these bilateral summits are also in the works. Now, given that the U.S. is firm on its stance in maintaining sanctions on North Korea, while South Korea at the same time is seeking inter-Korean projects, what sort of things do you think will be on the table if President Moon does sit down for talks with these regional players?
Well, clearly, last month when President Moon visited Europe, his talking point on that issue was to try to get the critical players on the Security Council, namely UK and France, to come around to the idea of easing sanctions, in this particular case, UN international sanctions. The other three players, the permanent 5 members on the Security Council who have a veto power that will have a say on this, is the United States, China, and Russia. And so, again, we need to have buy-in from Beijing and Moscow on these issues if The goal here is to ease the UN sanctions so that economic cooperation can occur more freely between both North and South, and also to allow other interested private sector players to invest on various projects in North Korea. There were some talks earlier last month about a potential visit or actual visit by a U.S. agricultural company, Cargill. So expect to see that he's trying to get these different players, including the United States, to agree to some kind of sanctions relief, partial sanctions relief, to get a progress, a material progress that you can measure on the economic front with North Korea.
Now, going back to the president's trip, he's back on with his multilateral diplomacy efforts, and it's been a year since he first laid out his new Southern policy. Now, just for viewers who may not be familiar, it seeks to better connect South Korea to ASEAN nations and expand Seoul's economic influence. How do you assess the achievements so far, if there has been any, and what do you think President Moon is trying to pursue out of his trip this time around?
Well, there's an idea that the president has sort of laid out called a new Southern policy, and it's part of a broader initiative on Northeast Asia. There's a northern component, but the southern component mainly focuses on both Southeast Asia as well as South Asia. So it's not clear at the moment exactly what this new Southern policy is, but clearly there's a recognition by President Moon that Southeast Asia is important. $120 billion plus of trade between the two countries, 5 million or over of South Koreans visiting that region, and over 2 million visiting South Korea on a year-to-year basis. That's about 7 million visitors going both ways. 420,000 plus Southeast Asians live and reside and work in South Korea, and 200,000 plus South Koreans living in that region. So there's a lot of exchange there. There are deep ties that not only span the economy, but also people-to-people exchanges as well. That is very important. So overall, I think the idea of the new Southern policy touches on sort of these three aspects. One is people, the other is prosperity, and then finally this third component of peace. So it'll be interesting how he tries to come out with details that are related to these three pillars of his new Southern strategy, and we'll look forward to seeing that. On the APEC side, again, on the economic front, the president has a lot of work that he needs to accomplish there, and part of that has to do with the fact that Chorus FTA ratification process has somewhat been, delayed because of, lack of details on the U.S. side about exemptions on the auto tariff, and it's not clear yet at the moment how this is going to all work out. And the president does need to hedge there and find other trade partners in order to manage that risk with the United States. And so APEC, clearly very important region that also includes the United States, but other countries, and part of the TPP as well as the Chinese-led RCEP. And so all of these are very important for the president. He needs to find other ways to offload some of the risks associated with trades with countries like the United States and also China.
So I guess we will have to see if there's any trade deals or MOUs that come out of those meetings. Now, as part of efforts to promote peace on the peninsula, South Korea's Unification Minister has also headed to the U.S., and a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also highly likely. Now, it's the first time in about 4 years for a sitting Unification Minister to visit the U.S. What do you think will top the agenda?
Well, clearly, economic cooperation between not only North Korea and South Korea, but between other interested parties in North Korea is going to be important here. And what kind of sanctions relief, if any, is possible, and what kinds of interests would be interested in taking up this approach. So it's going to be important for him to not only talk to the officials in the United States, but also try to get a feel for whether or not the private sectors want to buy in on this as well in the U.S. And this was a trip that was planned way in advance. It was announced about a month ago, but as I understand it, the Ministry of Unification's broader initiative to connect Korea globally, and this is the U.S. component of that. And yes, in the past, Unification Minister hasn't really made this trip for that Korea Global Forum, but in this year, I think there's an extra significance given the developments on the peninsula.
Yes, it has drawn attention because usually the minister is in charge of North Korea issues. Now, staying with the North Korea issue, U.S. think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says it has identified at least 13 of an estimated 20 undeclared missile bases inside North Korea. Now, the South Korean government says the findings aren't anything new, but it does come at a time when the U.S. has been demanding Pyongyang to submit a list of its nuclear facilities and weapons. Do you think this report will be a variable in the future denuclearization talks?
Well, you know, at the highest level, when it comes to intel on North Korea, I think both South Korea and the United States were very much aware of these facilities. Maybe there might have been some disagreements about what was happening in these facilities, if there were new developments, as the report suggests. But it clearly does put the Trump administration in a difficult position, given that it needs to now contend with any kinds of questions, public questions. This information now, given that it's out in the open, the Trump administration does need to respond to it in some way. And that's largely because of the impact that this may have on shifting public opinion in the United States about this matter, one way or the other. If the administration sees a roadblock and the public opinion turning against the president's diplomatic approach to North Korea, then it will be very difficult for him to maintain that policy, given the public opposition and given that he has re-election coming up in 2 years. The second issue is, you know, how does Congress play this in Washington? And is Congress going to pressure the president and use this as an issue to exercise oversight power against the president, create more problems for him? Again, this is one less thing that the president will probably want to deal with, given that he has a lot of other issues that he wants to get through before his term is over. There's a third factor. How does this play for the South Korean public and President Moon? Does President Moon have to spend his political capital to maintain his current position and stance on North Korea? And then finally, are we seeing just the tip of the iceberg here? Is there more coming out about North Korea? And is the K Street on notice? Because this was a think tank on K Street that's trying to make this case. And are there other information that hasn't been released yet that could potentially be a problem moving forward on North Korea-related issues? So all of these are potential factors or variables that can influence the calculations both in Seoul and Washington.
So something to keep our eyes on there as well. Inter-Korean dialogue or exchanges seem to be unaffected despite the stalled talks between the U.S. and North Korea. And a high-level delegation from Pyongyang will visit South Korea on Wednesday. Now, the trip is primarily to attend an international conference, but the delegation is drawing attention because it has Kim Sung-hae and Lee Jong-hyuk, who have been involved in Pyongyang-Washington talks as well as inter-Korean dialogue. While Seoul says they won't be meeting any high government officials here, what are the prospects? What do you think?
I think anytime a ranking official from a country like North Korea visits Seoul, it shouldn't be taken lightly. Whether the symbolic significance of that, what kinds of symbolic significance it has for both the public that is hearing about this and watching this, both here in Korea and also in North Korea. So I think that it shouldn't be taken lightly on the one hand. On the other hand, so what's the purpose of the visit? Is it, if it's not to talk to officials in the South Korean government, maybe all the official talks were done, are already underway on a potential summit in Seoul a potential visit by Kim Jong-un. Maybe this is a logistical visit, the visit that deals with the logistics behind that visit by Kim Jong-un. You know, what kinds of hotels he could potentially stay in, what would be the route that he would take from the DMZ to Seoul, or if he takes a plane then from Incheon Airport into Seoul, what would that look like, and what kinds of security things that they need to get ready for their leader as he makes his way from the airport to Seoul. So there are a lot of different details that they would need to work out, and that's a little difficult to do if you're doing that in Pyongyang. So having the officials here and walking through the different facilities, taking a look at some potential risks and how to manage those risks and deal with them, and the logistical details about a potential trip, I think is probably what they're here to do. If that's the case, then well, what we should expect is a visit sometime, as you know, the administration has been saying, before the end of the year, or if not before the end of the year, then sometime early next year. So highly anticipate a visit by Kim Jong-un, perhaps sometime very soon.
Yeah, the Seoul government says the options are still open. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.